Land of the Mutant Pizzas and Other Weirdness by Gemini Biggs, illustrated by Joe Tomato. I came across another wilderness. It was, on the face of it, much like all the other wildernesses I'd seen. Previously, I'd crossed a great lake where hot dogs as big as the great sharks that died out but used to prowl the now algae-ridden oceans would gobble up anything or anyone stupid enough to come their way. I'd found a good boat with a serviceable sow and spent weeks patching it up as best I could. Hot dogs swarmed around me, leaping at my bow just as extinct dolphins used to 100 years ago. They bumped into my craft, but the wind was in my favour and kept me skipping along at a pace of knots. Had I been becalmed, my fate would have been sealed, for they'd surely have capsized me. I had also traversed the valley of fried chicken, where I fought giant legs and wings, horrible entities without eyes or mouths, who nevertheless could stomp a victim into the ground and absorb him through their wrinkly, mutated skin. At that time, I had a machine gun and a hand-drawn trailer with which to carry ammunition and act as a mounting for the gun, which was of a heavy-duty kind. I splattered the friars by the dozen till I ran out of ammo and had to run for it. Now, as I faced a new wilderness, I was hopelessly unarmed and unaware what mutated forces awaited me, for awaiting me they surely were. It was a landscape once inhabited by people. Thousands, maybe millions had thronged there, built lives and built their great monuments that had touched the sky, but which now lay in ruins and tatters, poking up redundantly through the desert sands and ubiquitous dust. I found a shaft of wood and sharpened the tip with my knife. It was a small knife an old man had given me years before in a sanctuary, before the horde of yumburgers came slouching over the horizon and sacked us. It was a small knife, red outside, 2 blades and other small implements like a mini saw, magnifying glass, pliers, and other useful things. It called it a Swiss Army knife, though I had no idea what Swiss meant or what happened to its army. It was so well made it had already lasted 100 years and more, and would probably go on for at least another century. I thought if I ever had a son, I'd pass it on to him, though it was doubtful I ever would be a father again. My makeshift spear would have to do. I needed to cross this wilderness, which stretched out as far as my eyes could see, or I'd never be able to find my daughter, who had been whisked away as the sanctuary fell in our battered yet functional flying machine. I knew where they were going, well, sort of, to what might be a myth or a real territory where people could live free and without fear, if such a thing was indeed at all possible. Thus armed, I set off following my little compass's direction to the west. Derelict, collapsed buildings lay on either side as I followed the remnants of a highway littered with the rusted remains of cars and buses. Working motorised vehicles were incredibly rare. I'd seen a few working when I was a boy, due to my father's skill at putting them together from parts. But by the time I grew up, such parts had largely rusted to nothing or vanished below the sands. I hadn't gone too far when I spotted a beast. It wasn't moving, which was often the case when they weren't chasing food. These creatures, if creatures is an accurate description for such unholy entities, would sit idly until they felt a vibration, for they possessed no ears and no eyes, but they could feel very slight movements and trembles. This particular form of slumbering beast I'd never come across before, but of course I'd heard of them and seen the pictures drawn by those who had. They were called Gammons, huge rolls of solid meat, no brain, no senses as we understand them, except the one ability to feel disturbances in the ground. When awakened, they'd roll towards their quarry, gaining momentum and crushing everything in their way, unless stopped by a steep grading or the still strong foundations of some old structure. Best strategy when attacked was to gain the high ground as fast as possible, but I needed to go onward, not hide. Thus I decided to do the best thing in my armoury, to creep as slowly and carefully as possible, so as not to be detected by the listless monster. I got round the first of the bacon-eyed beasts, but up ahead lay another one. I continued on, but as I approached the living meat fest, the ground beneath me suddenly started cracking and collapsing into a sinkhole. I managed to dive to one side, avoiding the abyss under my feet, but as I got back up, I saw the gammon was beginning to stir. Shit. I darted towards one of the ruins on my right. It was the only high ground I had a chance of reaching in time. I ran with all my strength and gained the building a little ahead of the gammon, which was rapidly catching up with me. The lower stairs were gone, but I leaped up and got a grip on the higher staircase banister. I pulled myself up and scrambled towards the top of the ruin. The derelict building shook as the gammon crashed into it, but it held firm, at least for now. Looking over the top wall, I hurled my spear down at the mutant. It went deep into the beast, but was nowhere near enough to dismember or cause it enough damage to stop its momentum. The only way we had to defeat these beasts was to literally take them apart, otherwise they just kept going. There was no chance of inflicting internal wounds on such mutants, for they had no internal organs whatsoever. The gammon rolled back and came again, shaking my wobbly castle to its core. I knew it was only a question of time before the whole thing collapsed and I'd either be crushed by the shredded concrete or absorbed by the gammon as I hit the floor. I held on, hoping for a miracle, some distraction that had stopped the attack and turned the creature's attention elsewhere. As powerless as I felt, I never lacked optimism and had a strong sense that fate would not deal me a fatal blow, at least not just yet. Then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, 3 objects in the distance coming my way. Soon they were close enough to identify, but I could hardly believe my eyes. They also rolled, but more like wheels than lumbering lumps of jellified meat. They were hurtling towards my position at a super fast speed, a triumvirate of possible salvation. I waved and shouted to them, "I'm here, over here." All 3 of them hit the gammon, one in the middle and the others at each end. Like saws, they cut the gammon into 3 pieces, rendering it pretty useless. Then they all fell flat on top of the pieces, finally squashing the gammon into the dirt. I heaved a sigh of relief. I knew what these 3 giant wheels were, even if I'd not seen them before, as with the gammons. They were one of the few friends of humans in the wilderness that was left of planet Earth. I cautiously descended the staircase and came out into the open in front of the stationary pizzas. "Thank you," I said. "All part of the service, sir," one replied, though I didn't know which one, as the words came into my head, as they didn't have mouths with which to speak. "What topping would you like?" The words came again. "I'm sorry, I've no idea what's available." "I see," came the words into my head. "Come with us and we'll show you all the options." "Will there be other people there?" I asked, hopefully. "Yes, of course. Hop aboard." Feeling trepidatious, I said, "I'm afraid I might get too dizzy whizzing round and round." "No worries, sir. Just climb on board and we'll fly you to our outlet. It will be a smooth ride for sure, and you'll enjoy every moment of the experience, without a doubt." As a kid, back in the days when the sanctuary held its own against the mutant grills, we had books, even films, that my dad salvaged and would play on an old projector. Dad had found a whole collection of movies, mostly science fiction and fantasy. One was an adaptation of an ancient story where a boy flew on a magic carpet. I remembered this as my pizza took off vertically and gently whisked me away across the wastelands. We hovered only a few meters above the sand and dust dunes, like flying saucers from another alien world. As we skimmed along, I wondered where we were going and what awaited me there. But checking my compass, I was relieved to know we were at least heading due west. Like everything else in the surreal new world, there was no proper explanation why the pizzas had mutated but retained their loyalty to humanity. The vast majority of mutated fast foods had become vindictive and predatory, as though feeling eons of oppression for which they sought to reverse the situation, making people subject to and fed upon, victims of their own fatty creations. What caused the mutations in the first place? No one knew. Maybe it was scientific experiments gone wrong. Perhaps it was escaped toxins in the environment. But the fact was that mutate they did, and impossibly reproduce these mutations as well. Without sex, a burger would, at certain times, simply pop out a dozen mini burgers, like clones. The mutant beast devoured everything, all the animals, domestic or wild, as well as human crops and wild edibles. What was left was a life or death struggle between the surviving human communities and vicious mutant meat monsters. They hunted us, and we were forced to defend ourselves and also hunt them, for there was little other sustenance left on the planet. Eventually, we arrived at an outpost located in the middle of nowhere, much like every other place. We came to a rest outside and I disembarked, thanking my pizza heroes. I went inside and was immediately greeted by a woman who seemed to be serving a number of hungry customers who were sitting at tables neatly arranged around what was quite a large cafe-type joint. "What would you like, love?" she shouted from behind the counter. "I dunno. What do you have?" I shouted back, instantaneously realising my ignorance as I looked around at the clientele, all tucking into pizzas. "Pizza, of course," she yelled, laughing. "Any topping you like. It's all on the house here, love." "Do you have anchovy and olive?" I thought I'd give it a try, even if I'd only heard of such a thing in fairy tales. Yes, I can get you that, dearie, but you'll have to wait a while. It's an unusual request, okay?" "Yeah, that's fine. But have you got some water meantime? I haven't had a drink for hours." "Coke?" she responded, smiling. "You have Coke? Like real Coke?" "Oh yes, boyo, the real thing. Cold as ice and as frothy as a vicar's bubble bath." I didn't get the analogy, but felt my dry tongue and cracked lips watering at the thought of an actual Coca-Cola. "Yes, please," I stumbled to say, like a man in the midst of a mirage-like delusion. "Why don't you follow me, stranger?" the woman said, approaching me. "I'll show you what we've got at the back." I followed her. She wore a tight-fitting waitress outfit, like I'd seen in old books and magazines, and was still pretty, though she had obviously been around the block. Outside was a large building. I'd call it a warehouse or a barn. We entered there and I saw people gathering up baby pizzas as they were produced by several adults. It was like a production line or the milking of cows I'd heard about in times gone by. "We can get them to produce any kind of topping you want," said the waitress. "Mushroom, salami, ham, you name it," she continued, smiling cheerfully. "Get me an anchovy and olive, Sam," she gestured over to one of the workers. "Got you, Lil," came his reply. "Come and see this," Lil said, and I again followed her through the birthing barn and out a back door. And there in front of me was a huge can of Coke, standing against a wall. At its top had been placed a big tap, from which came a steady stream of the black fizzing liquid, which flowed into metal containers below. It continuously replenishes itself, said Lil with her usual engaging smile. It can't move, so it just sits there producing the goods. I sat alone by a small table next to the window and just stared unbelievingly at my full glass of fizzy Coke. I'd never tasted it before, but was aware, like everyone else, of its mythical, magical status. Finally, I put my parched lips to the glass and sipped gently at the precious fluid. It tasted so good, like an elixir, and I felt my energy levels soaring as I began to gulp it down more vigorously. Lil was watching me. That same immutable smile spread across her face. She immediately returned and filled my glass. "How was that, love?" she said, but I just looked back at her, mirroring her smile, and finally breaking out into a laugh myself. I couldn't help noticing that Lil had more than a passing resemblance to the actress Jenny Agutter. Not nearly as posh, perhaps, but she still retained her figure and youthful countenance despite her years, which I estimated to be in the late 30s. Then came the pizza. I didn't even know what an anchovy was, and olive trees had long ago gone the way of the dodo. But such a pizza was fixed in my mind from another book, a cookbook I had once read. The pizza tasted salty, very salty, but I devoured the whole thing quickly and sat back fully satisfied. "You want more?" said Lil. "Nah, that's enough. Best meal I've ever had." She poured me another Coke anyway, and I sat for a while digesting and thinking about my next move. That night, Lil showed me to a room above the barn. The place doubled as a hotel for wanderers and visitors. It was a small, simple room, but the bed was very comfortable. Lil disappeared but reappeared an hour later, brandishing a vintage bottle of vodka and more Coke. I asked her if they had a huge bottle of vodka hidden and constantly producing more of the stuff. I was getting hooked on her smile and was enjoying the effect I seemed to be having on this waitress, who actually seemed to be running the joint. We drank together and talked about how this oasis of hers had come about and how they kept it together. She told me that after a while, the taste of pizza for every meal got boring. We laughed a lot and at some point found ourselves cavorting like spaced out teenagers on the bed. Later, I told her of my mission to find my daughter. I said that when I did find her, for find her I must, we'd return to stay long term. Lil seemed enthusiastic about the idea. The thought of eternal pizza would take quite some time to become dull, as far as I was concerned, and Lil, though more than a few years older than me, was quite a wholesome, bubbly woman, and well worth the effort. Next morning, I set off on foot towards the west. The giant pizzas that had brought me to the cafe would not travel farther westwards. "That's Burgerland," Lil had informed me. "We don't go there, and they don't come here." I asked her if the mythical Freeland really existed, but all she answered was, maybe, beyond Burgerland. I headed directly across the dunes in the direction of some distant hills, beyond which Lil had warned me that there was a great kebab swamp, and after that a huge expanse rife with all kinds of mutant burgers, and God knows what else. By the end of the day, I'd reached, climbed, scaled and descended the hills. In front of me was a flat, muddy terrain, out of which poked huge kebabs. Their pita bread mouths lay wide open so as to catch anything that might stumble into them, in which case they'd spring shut like Venus flytraps. Around them grew chow mein noodles like elasticated trees. They could whip out like lassos, grabbing unfortunates and hurling them into the mouths of the kebabs. It was a co-evolutionary partnership. The kebabs got fresh meat and their excrement then fed the noodle trees. I carefully made my way through and around the gaping kebabs and waving noodles, without any real trouble, except for the mud that made my boots feel like lead weights. At last, I clambered out of the mud and looked over the escarpment that bordered the swamp. It was a strange, weird sight that I then beheld before me. A veritable fast food palace was plonked in the middle of the wasteland. It shone like some enormous bright diamond set below the darkening sky. Around it, like guards, stood a number of gigantic multi-layered burgers. I knew, as I gazed upon this wonder, that this was the target of my quest. I pondered how best to make my approach. Burgers were dangerous beasts, prone to absorbing any human that came near. But they were brainless, stupid creatures without even basic animal instincts except to react to vibrations. They were like zombies, just sitting there vegetating until a movement got them shuffling along towards their prey. I figured that if I took my time and crept forward silently, I might just be able to stay undetected and reach the palace door. It hadn't worked with the Gammons, but that was just plain bad luck. But no sooner had I started out than a whole gang of human-sized French fries came bounding and bouncing out of the palace and was soon upon me. "Viens avec nous," said one of the fries, speaking into my head just as the pizzas had done. "I beg your pardon," I replied, confused at the odd language. "Viens avec nous," it said again, more stridently. "Oh," I exclaimed, "it's French." "Ah, you're French fries. I get it. Oh, that's very good. But I don't understand French, I'm afraid." Then, before I gathered myself together, I was being frog-marched towards the palace. Actually, it was more like being frog-hopped, as the fries had no legs and so bounced pogo stick style. We soon arrived at the main door, and a fry said, "Entree," which I did understand. The door slid open automatically, and I stepped inside. I was gobsmacked. Inside, the palace looked like a vision of a mini-futuristic city. It was like a scene out of Logan's Run, an old movie I'd been a big fan of as a kid. Jenny Agutter, as Jessica in the film, became my all-time notion of what an attractive female should look like. I walked around the gaily decorated halls, staring at the people, who all appeared to be in their 20s or younger, and dressed uncannily just like the people in Logan's Run. It couldn't be an accident. I thought someone or something had designed all this on purpose, and how many of these jolly, relaxed and carefree young people would even be aware of the movie I was seeing come to life in the so-called real world? Not many, I reckoned. I figured I might as well visit one of the many restaurants that infested the city. There were burger joints and burger joints, burger joints and more burger joints. That was it. Not much of a choice, but at least it was food. After ordering, I took a pew and was suddenly confronted with a slim young lady standing over me. "Dad, is that you?" It was Sylvia, my daughter. We embraced for a time, and then she sat down, still looking very surprised to see me, whereas I, for my part, had felt a sense of fatefulness ever since I'd first clapped eyes on the palace, and even before that. Sylvia told me that the flying machine, which had lifted her away from the sanctuary and was piloted by Duggan, an old friend of my dad's who had got the thing up and running, had made a false landing not far from the great kebab swamp after being ambushed by a flock of rogue fried chicken wings. The other passengers, as well as Duggan, didn't survive the crash. Wandering around dazed, she'd been picked up by some French fries and escorted to the palace. I was sad about Duggan. He had been my last connection to my dead father, as well as a great believer that somewhere across the vast emptiness was a place where people could live civilized, normally, and free from all the bad tricked beasties out there. Sylvia showed me around the city, which was more the size of a big old-fashioned shopping mall. There was a swimming pool, gymnasium, cinema, but I never saw Logan's run on the upcoming events poster. Dance hall, and my favourite, a towering greenhouse chock full of little fruiting trees. Above it all were the personal apartments, which were well furnished and had luxuries like running water. I learned that alcohol was banned along with anything resembling a weapon, and also that no one was allowed to leave. Any attempt to break out was met by either being captured by the French fries, who acted like an in-house police force, and jailed for a time, or would face absorption by the King Burgers patrolling the perimeter outside. Interestingly, yet disturbingly, Sylvia explained that every so often a selection happened. A few people would be randomly chosen to be sent to other palaces that were said to be in construction far, far away. No one had ever seen one of these new palaces, and there was no contact between them that anyone had heard of. What was known was that those selected were never seen again. I asked her what was in it for the burgers, but she just shrugged and said, "I don't know." "Aren't you at all curious?" I pressed on. "No, not really," she shrugged again. I noticed the complete lack of critical thinking on her part, and as I came to meet others, it was the same story. Lots of questions filled my mind. What was the real purpose of this place? Why were there no older people? Why didn't anyone ask questions? Was the population being drugged into conformity somehow? But most of all, I was thinking about how to get the hell out of there, and how was I to persuade Sylvia to come with me? She was obviously attuned to the situation, comfortable, had lots of friends, and was in no hurry to return to the dangerous wilderness outside. In some ways, I couldn't blame her for that. Comfort and abundance are big sellers for human beings who, when immersed in a culture without cares or stress, will often forget that such luxuries are liable to indicate their actual enslavement. I needn't have worried, because after a couple of days everything went sideways. We were in one of the smaller cafes, munching on our burgers, when all of a sudden everything went black. Suddenly, metal screens came down all over the windows and doors. The lights went off and a siren started blaring. We jumped up, but Sylvia froze, her face wearing a horrified expression. "What is it?" I blurted. "We've been selected, Dad. This is how they do it." There were only around half a dozen other customers in the cafe, and we all stood there like rabbits, caught in the headlights, waiting for what was coming next. Then we were falling through the floor and landing inside a solid white room below the cafe. It was cold in there. My mind raced, and within seconds I got the idea. "They're going to freeze us to death," I whispered. "That's what all this is about. They supply the food, but the payback is they eat us in return. It's like the Eloi and the Morlocks." "What are Morlocks?" Sylvia asked. "Ah, just another old movie you've never heard of," I clipped back impatiently. Unfortunately, the mutant burgers hadn't reckoned on someone as resistant and resourceful as myself. I was no Eloi. I wasn't going to walk into my doom like some hypnotised airhead. Fortunately, I hadn't been searched, so I still had my little knife. Took it out and began working on the locked door. It took a long time, gigging and scraping, to start to loosen the latch, but I hung on in there. Everyone else walked up and down, trying to keep warm as the temperature plunged. At last, I started getting somewhere, and then the latch itself sprung and the door swung open with a bang and a clatter. Then we found ourselves in the service tunnels under the palace. We made our way along silently and slowly, looking for an escape route. How we'd be able to get past the fries and burgers, I had no clue, but there was no choice but to make a break for it, or become fast food for fast food. The tunnel opened into a bigger space, and we saw a truck sitting there in front of us. "Wow," I said under my breath. A truck. What it was there for, I wasn't sure. Maybe it was used to transport the food to and from the palace. Whatever the case, I got the others into the back and jumped into the cab. The keys were in the dash. She was ready to go. Sylvia climbed in next to me, looking shaky and afraid. I reassured her. I drove one of these back in my youth. My dad got it going and taught me. Don't worry, we're getting out of here right now, and nothing's gonna stop us. We crashed out of the underground garage and sped towards the hills the way I'd come. The exit was to the rear of the palace and a big burger was standing in our way. "Hold on," I shouted, and putting on a burst of speed, I hit the fat burger straight on. It fell to the left. My back wheels went over it so it lay squashed and immobilised. Next came a band of French fries, all crying, "Vive la Revolution!" for some obscure reason, but I ran several of them over too, and the rest scattered in disarray. I opened the window, stuck out one finger and shouted back, "Fuck your revolution." Soon we were zigzagging through the mud of the Kebab swamp, where the vehicle eventually became bogged down, entangled in Noodles, and came to a stop. "Come on, get out and run," I commanded the people in the truck. As the chocolate donut sun began to set, Sylvia, Lil and I sat outside the pizza joint, glasses of cold Coke in hand, watching the spectacle of the giant pizzas spinning like tops in front of us. "Why do they do that?" I asked Lil, who grinned and said, "I'm not sure, but it's a sign of their happiness, I think." Then Sylvia looked at me and ventured, "But you never told me, Dad. Who exactly are the Morlocks and Eloi?" I could see this had been on her mind since we escaped the palace. "Well, that's quite a story," I replied, looking at Lil and laughing. I felt content to be back with Lil and have my daughter with me, but inside I couldn't stop thinking about the palace, the people trapped there, being farmed like domesticated livestock. How could those burgers, those dumb pieces of mutated meat, manage to run such a sophisticated operation? No, it wasn't possible. As I'd suspected before, when I was in the palace itself, there must be an intelligence behind it all. I decided then and there that it would fall to me to discover the truth and put an end to the whole sordid business. The end. But to be continued. Written by Gemini Biggs, illustrated by Joe Tomato, August 2024. Adieu.